Oh, hello you. It's been a while since I've made a video. Did I even read anything in the last couple months? Today we're gonna go through all the books that I read in September and October. I read about 12 books in those 2 months. I reach an average of about 6 a month. And I read a lot of Booker stuff, some Nobel stuff, of course, but there were some other books on the margins of that I kind of wanted to talk about. But let's try and go chronologically. The first book I read was This Strange Eventful History. The more I think about it, the more I hate it. I think it's the worst book I've read all year, but I have a dedicated review for that. The next book I read was Playground, which is another Booker nominee, and I've come to dislike that one more and more as well. I think Powers is an idiot. And I won't read another one of his books unless I have to. The characters were cringe, and the plot was overreaching, and yeah, I thought it was awful. And the next book I read was a book that was longlisted for the National Book Award, I think, and the only reason I read it was because it was about 80 pages long, and it was called The Most. I got a copy of this tiny book without having to pay for it, and I read it in about an hour. The book is about a housewife who goes into a pool and then refuses to come out. It's kind of a funny premise, but the book does nothing at all to make the premise interesting or funny. A lot of this book is really obvious. The satire is super obvious, and it's been done to death. If you haven't seen American Beauty, it's literally that. There's that movie Swallow too, which is kind of similar. It has just the same tone as these satires of family and class in the 50s that I just didn't think this did anything unique. People do things because that's how they know humans do things, and oh my gosh, society is so boring and makes you conform, and then the wildness of humankind comes out in different ways. Oh, how interesting. I think the book could have kept the joke going for longer at the beginning instead of front-loading with all of this historical detail and all of this character detail for absolutely no reason. The book gives you no reason to care, and it just dumps everything on you, and it's so boring. I think starting with the pool and extending the first initial joke for longer of the husband trying to convince her to come out and her just going no, and it's kind of funny and wry, but the book does not spend enough time doing that. We really only cut back to the pool like 3 times, and the rest of it is just info dumps about their entire lives. Yeah, it's boring, and I did not like it. And this could have absolutely been a short story, a short story. The next book I read was another book that could have been much shorter. It was a Scottish winner of the Booker Prize, and it was How Late It Was, How Late. I went into this book thinking I'd love it and that I'd find it to be really crazy and complicated, and I did not feel that at all. So this book is a stream of consciousness narration from the perspective of a Scottish man who goes blind, and then he does things. And the book did not commit to its stream of consciousness premise because it always let you know exactly what was happening. So the book claims to be written in a Scottish dialect the whole way through, and I would always prefer for a book to commit to that, like The Wake. But there are sections, whole paragraphs of this book that aren't written in Scottish dialect so that you know exactly what's happening, so that the book can hold your hand. And I don't know why Kelman did that. It was totally unclear why the narrator was talking to us in Scots, because often the Scots is just replacing the word your with yeah, Y-E-R, and that would be the only change to a normal sentence. So maybe the book was just sold to me wrong. Sometimes the book is really in Sammy's head to the point of being in first person, but the book isn't in first person. Sometimes the book is really Scots and some of the writing is incomprehensible, and then sometimes it's really obvious and really easy, and I just wanted the book to commit. Because when you have that as a gimmick, as the Scots dialect, the writing feels arbitrary when it isn't always like that. Apparently, that dialect is just spelling mistakes. Like, that's all it is. And just more swears. I wasn't expecting to side with some of the Booker judges that really didn't like this, but I mean, I still thought it was fine. The best thing that the book did to me, because a lot of it was actually pretty great, the best thing the book did was give you a realistic encounter of a blind man who's newly blind, exploring the world. Unfortunately, that blind man just has this monotone nihilistic philosophy of fuck it, we live or we die, and that was the way he ended every section. I don't even know what you're meant to take from this book as a book. I will read more books from him to see what else he's done and to see if his characters all sound the same. But this one, I'm shocked that this was a Booker winner. This is easily the strangest Booker winner. Way stranger than Lincoln in the Bardo and all of that, because a lot of those weird books that have won the Booker have very clear and easily digestible themes. Lincoln in the Bardo is a very easily digestible book, even though it is weird. This book is not easily digestible at all, although it is in terms of its writing. So I don't know what the Booker judges took from this, but it was interesting to read, I will say that. And I will read more from Kelman, even though this left me feeling kind of empty and dry. The next book I read was the first of 3 parts in Janet Frame's autobiography called To the Island. That's the only book I read that I took no notes on, and I've kind of forgotten it. But I remember thinking it was pretty good, and I will read the parts of her book that get to the mental hospital. But from what I read, I understand why she's kind of the New Zealand legend that she is. The next book I read was another Scottish book, which was Ali Smith's Autumn. I've wanted to read this for a while because of the way people talk about it. They say, oh, it's the best book ever written. Oh my gosh. Oh, best book of the century. It is not that. I can't think of a single book I've read recently that was so, on a sentence-to-sentence level, as try-hard as Ali Smith is. And it regularly made me laugh with how hard she was trying to sound clever. There's not a single sentence in this book from, let's say, the old man's perspective that is a normal, rational sentence used to denote action or movement. Every single thing she said had to be the most complicated or unique way to say it. And it was never necessarily bad, but it was funny. This is the one from her that everybody was saying, oh, if you're gonna read one book from her, you have to read this. You have to read this one. And now that I don't love this book, people are gonna go, no, you actually have to read this other one. You have to read, that's the good Ali Smith. I've read one, I will not read anymore for a bit. Leave me alone. What I found is that if you explain what she's doing at any given point, in just a logical way, you make her sound like the dumbest author ever. For example, let's take the first sentence of the book Autumn. The first sentence of the book Autumn is the sentence, it was the worst of times, it was the worst of times. This is a reference to the classic, very indie, underseen Dickens book, A Tale of Two Cities, which begins, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. This is what we call an intertextual reference. Ali Smith here has said, it was the worst of times, it was the worst of times, instead of, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And in changing that sentence, Ali Smith has really let you know that it was indeed the worst of times. What is she, 5? It's pretty insistent in, like, the marketing and in its style that everything it's doing is connecting back to Brexit. But there are large chapters of this book that do not feel connected at all, and it feels like the author is really encouraging you to see that she's smart and try to find these hidden connections that I'm not entirely sure are there. I think some of this book is random, which is not necessarily a problem. I think Ali Smith likes to shitpost a little bit. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The dream stuff in the old man's perspective is great, but I'm not going to interrogate how that ties directly back to Brexit, like all of the stuff with the younger woman and the post office and trying to get her passport sorted. That's such a direct, clearly sledgehammer satire that trying to connect all this other really vague stuff to Brexit is kind of fruitless. There's no point to do it. I also don't take this book as some searing criticism of current day Britain that it was clearly being interpreted as. I think Ali Smith is just a bit of a shitposter. And I didn't hate this book, but come on guys, it's not a masterpiece. The next books I read after this were 3 books by our new Nobel laureate Kang. Of those 3, I liked Human Acts the best, and it wasn't even close. That's the book that's going to go on my shelf. The other 2 I thought were okay, but yeah, Human Acts I thought was really solid, and I was happy with that as a Nobel winner in general, even though I would put her more towards the lower half of winners this century. I then read a book called It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over, which was a joint winner of the Novel Prize, previously won by an Australian author for her book Cold Enough for Snow. It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over. I thought this book sucked. And you know, I wouldn't compare this book to Lincoln in the Bardo like I've heard other people do if the tone of these 2 books was not the exact same. It's the same deadpan, jokey, whoa, isn't it weird that I'm explaining this weird thing totally matter-of-factly? Very similar quirky side characters, quite a similar premise. A lot of the characters end up with weird mutilations. That's a weird comparison between the 2 books. This book had not a unique bone in its body, and I refuse to think otherwise. The ways characters interact with their environments is very similar between the 2 books, but Lincoln in the Bardo is balls to the wall. It does not do the same thing for more than 5 pages in a row, and it's a really easy to like book because it's very digestible outside of all the craziness. The book is, like, totally aimless. The characters start in a hotel, and I thought the way that we were seeing this hotel, it's these people who are perhaps newly dead, and they have new senses, they have new awareness of the world around them, they can do new things, and the way that that was shown I thought was quite good. The first 40 or so pages of this book I thought were really engaging, and I was curious to see where it was going to go. How foolish of me. The book never does anything interesting after that. It has no ambition, it doesn't achieve anything, it's useless, and the book never found an answer to its own nihilism and the endless pondering on these people and their new abilities and, like, really in-depth analysis of its environment that doesn't exist, I thought was pointless. And you expect there to be an answer in the logic of what the book does, and because there isn't, a lot of the, like, ponderous theorizing on what these spirits are felt like redundant wheel spinning. Oh, what are these people? Do they hunger? Do they have grief? I don't care. Again, this isn't real. The ability of this author to conjure this environment and render it in immense detail doesn't matter if there's not a point to it. I didn't think the book was totally, like, awful or anything. I like the way that memories from the main character's viewpoint would come into the story. They always came in at interesting moments. And I liked a lot of the description of the limbo environment, but none of the main character's observations were very interesting, and I was never given a reason to care about them. I also didn't like beginning every section of the book with a quote. It felt really pretentious and like a debut novel. There was one part that began with a Charles Simic quote. That was hype as hell. I love Charles Simic, so that was cool to see him. But every other quote, I was like, you don't have to have this. The profundity of the book does not increase and does not change. Again, if the book is dealing with something that isn't real and has never been real and that nobody has experienced, there has to be a point to tie it back into real life, and there has to be a reason to care, and the book does not do that, or at least doesn't do it in a way that's unique and not just what George Saunders does. Apparently, if a book is quirky, it's also considered unique and is able to win prizes. So that's a call to any debut novelist or anybody who's trying to write a book. If you just make your book quirky and you write it in a deadpan tone and you describe something strange, and I've read a lot of books recently that do that, it's a masterpiece. The next book I read was The Exploded View by Ivan Vladislavic, who is a white South African author. The only reason I read this book was because he was put alongside Gary L. Lutz in some polling for the Nobel Prize, and they were given about 100-to-1 odds. And that really appeals to my hipster self in reading something that might not have been heard of, and that might be something really unique and criticky, and not something that a lot of people are engaging with. And I really felt that with this book. This is a very criticky book. This book is 4 short stories connected by theme. I'd compare it most reasonably to In a Free State, the V.S. Naipaul book. This book is about apartheid from the perspective of bored white men. But this book is more just about how these people live in that world, and less about really critically analyzing that theme or like deconstructing it. At least that's my perspective. I feel like the book is just set in a world that has apartheid in it and explores how people interact with it without really giving like a moral lesson. I've seen this author compared, or contrasted I should say, to J.M. Coetzee, because Coetzee always has like a point, like Disgrace has a really clear point at the end of the book. And this one, I would say, doesn't, although it is doing a lot. All this book is about characters who are cut off from the worst parts of apartheid, kind of skimming it. They're not even coming into contact with it. They're just kind of seeing other perspectives, and they just don't really know how to engage with it. They're really self-aware people, usually, or they're very aware of how people are interacting with them, but they can't really understand why they're doing it. Which I thought was interesting. A lot of the characters are really clear instruments of apartheid or gentrification. One of the characters is a census taker, another character is like a sewage constructor. So they're instruments of apartheid, but they're just really bored people who just live their day-to-day lives. Maybe they want to have an affair or like have a nice party or something, but they're just instruments for a larger, worse thing, and it's really interesting how these people do not care. And I found the obliviousness and normality of their lives intensely satirical. And these normal white people try to take advantage of apartheid situations in ways that are totally like meaningless and like trivial and selfish, and not in ways that are like really dramatic, like in Disgrace or something like that. At one point, one of the characters calls apartheid as a topic a casual conversation stopper, which I thought was a really good and clear way of explaining what the author is trying to do. My favorite part of the book is how the themes of it come out and become darker as the book goes along. The first story is just about a guy who's attracted to a black woman in an area where he's taking a census. And the book is not really, I mean, he's creepy, but that story is not super intense or scary. And then the second story, the characters are interacting with the black community more, and you're like, okay, I see what you're doing. And then in the third story, it's about this really violent art, and then the fourth story has this dark undercurrent. So the book gets darker as it goes on and starts to come into contact more more with its topic, and I love books that do that. There's lots of really great writing in this book too. This author is a very wry and interesting writer, and he is comparable to Gary L. Lutz in some of the ways he comes up with unique sentences. One quote I loved was, he was suspended between the floor and the ceiling like a human sacrifice. The mattress felt to him like the soft edge of a bar graph. That's such a strange line. I love it. I will say my major reserve with the book is some of the satire comes on really strong and stupid for how reserved a lot of it is. In the second chapter, there's a extended sequence where there's a character sitting on a toilet, and that was all really stupid and deliberately stupid, but I couldn't figure out how the stupidity of it connected to the rest of that story. Well, I kind of could, but making it comedic was the thing I wasn't really able to understand. There's a lot of immature metaphors and moments in the stories that don't connect to how inscrutable a lot of the tone is, which was what I liked more. Gary L. Lutz is a lot more committed and medical with her writing to the point of, like, extreme, and this book doesn't do that as much. There were sections of this book that I was a little bit bored with, but I did like the mundanity of a lot of what it was talking about, especially the ending of the second story I thought was kind of brilliant. And it's cool to read an author that is just not well known. I do like doing that. But now we can move on to the best book that I have read in the last 2 months, and it's probably one of the best books I've read all year. It might be better than Austerlitz for me, I don't know, but I absolutely adored this book. And I've now committed to reading every book from this author that she wrote. And the book that I read was Penelope Fitzgerald's Offshore. Every time I finish a book, I'm usually done and ready to move on. With this book, this is the first time, probably all year, that I felt sad to have finished the book because of just how good it was. Offshore is a Booker Prize winner. It's also the shortest Booker Prize winner, and it's a book about people who live on riverboats on the Thames that are moored to the bank. That's all you need to know. This is not a super descriptive book. We don't get endless lyricisms about life on the river and all of this really heavy detail. The book does give you that, but it's also very witty and very sad and very complicated, and the characters are extremely well defined. And when the book is describing its environment, it does so with such a lived-in feeling that is so rare. It felt like one of the most lived-in books I've ever read. Apparently Penelope Fitzgerald did this. She did live on the Thames. That's crazy. But yeah, the way characters interacted with their environment was so realistic for who they were. It's a grand telling of life in an in-between state that doesn't demonize or consider them as being in a spot where they shouldn't be. And the ending of the book is so sad for how it does eventually cause them to choose things. The book absorbed me completely, and I couldn't bring myself to do other things while I read it. And the controlled use of provoking the reader's imagination in this book, as opposed to some other books I read about romanticized topics that just endlessly describe them, I thought the way that she controlled what she was doing here meant that she was an author of just stunning talent. The author would subtly remind you of which character was which, because it's so short and there's quite a lot of characters for how short it is. And the book would subtly remind you about which is which by introducing their goal or something their character wants every time they crop up, in a way that was totally natural and was something that was like what a refined author does. This book isn't much longer than small things like these, but this is much denser in detail. And I think that this book is better, honestly. It's so good. And all of the characters have such great endings, even though not all the endings are spelled out. The Richard character, he plays the hero a lot of the time, and him getting kind of beaten up and sent to hospital, and then his boat being taken away. Spoilers. Spoilers. A lot of that is really great. I love the way the characters end up in this book. Like, the way all of the characters end really makes me want to see more from them, and sad that we don't. The only thing I didn't like about this book was there are one too many moments where characters identify their situation in a way that's too weird, where characters go, we're in between states, we're one half on land and one half on water, and it just didn't make sense for them to be saying that, although the theme of the book is very clear. I connected with this book an inhuman amount, and a lot of that is because of the ending. The ending of this book is the best ending of any book I've ever read. I love books that are non-endings, or endings that feel totally surprising. I love being stunned by finishing a page and going, oh, that's the end. And this book ends in its climax without spoiling it. And when you finish the book, you go, is that how we're doing it? And then over time, you really come to understand why the author did that and why it's actually a very profound and really excellent ending. It's a dramatic final image to confuse you, and it really builds the emotion in you so that when it happens, you feel stunned by it. This is the best Booker winner ever, in my opinion, of the 20 or so that I've read. I can't think of any book that's better than this. And I would encourage every single person who watches BookTube who hasn't read this book to please do so. And with that, that's everything I read in September and October. Please stay tuned for the Booker Prize winner announcement reaction that I'll do in a couple of days from now. Boy, isn't that going to be a thrill. And thank you all. Bye!